All right, so if you didn't know already, you're here joining us for our Tree Keeper virtual event, but our organization is Forest Relief of Missouri, and our mission is planting trees and enriching communities. I just want to quickly go over what we know, and what we know and kind of why we are planting trees is because our natural ecosystem has been changing for a long time. If you look at these maps, and there's lots of other maps and information out there showing that our native Missouri forest used to be covering the whole state, and over time we have really diminished that forest and depleted our green infrastructure and created a lot more gray infrastructure. We also know that those trees that we had in our state have a huge value. I believe that I am preaching to the choir on a lot of these things, and I give this trees have value talk to a lot of different organizations and different groups. But the important thing that I want you all to understand, and why you're here understanding and learning the intricacies of tree maintenance and tree care, is because trees have such an important role to play in our communities. They're improving our cardiovascular health and, connecting people with nature in ways that are boosting health outcomes for babies and children with ADHD, for example. Obviously, taking in car emissions and cleaning our air and our water. They're reducing our energy costs in the summertime. All of y'all are probably thinking about your heating costs right now, but think about those 100-degree days in the summertime and your air conditioner's running like your heat's running now. And those trees play a big role in that. And also, I think so many of us have experienced those social benefits of trees through this pandemic, when we are really relying on the parks and our near nature to provide that comfort and even a little bit of community engagement. So we used to have a lot more trees, but we know the trees are of value. And we know in particular that the problem of tree loss is getting worse, especially in our communities and in our urban centers. These are some graphs of canopy cover. This is St. Louis City here on the left. Kansas City, I did see shout out to some of our Kansas City representatives on the call or in the course this time around. And then St. Louis County. And what you can see is that we're slowly losing canopy percentage across the community. And that is causing urban heat island, poor air quality, increased storm water runoff. And those negative impacts we're seeing are really significantly imbalanced in areas where people are struggling with a lot of other things and are underserved and marginalized, vulnerable communities. So that's where Forest Relief comes in. We're a 27-year-old organization, and we're responding to this challenge. We're creating a comprehensive solution-based approach to restoring that canopy, and we're doing it through things just like this Tree Keeper course. We also provide native trees and shrubs. Our main focus is providing trees and shrubs from our nursery. We train an army of Tree Keeper volunteers so we can have advocates and champions. We partner with a lot of organizations and corporations and others. We promote the benefits of trees, and then we enable those trees to be planted across the state. This is a great map representing our impact across the community. And this is an old map. So we've got, Mark's actually working on some new mapping information that hopefully we'll be getting onto our website here shortly. But I wanted to make sure that you all were understanding of our model. We're growing 20,000 trees at our community tree nursery in Creve Coeur Park. We're leveraging 30,000 hours, what we call people energy, the volunteers that help put those trees in the ground and help rear those trees at our nursery. We provide trees for public tree plantings for free. Those applications are open now. So if you aren't familiar, we do have free trees. Our free tree giveaway program is going on right now, and you can go onto the website and apply for trees for your projects in your community. We also reserve 15-gallon larger size trees for underserved neighborhoods and disaster recovery. Whoop, sorry about that. And then part of our whole capacity building is to teach the public about the value of trees and how to take care of them. So that's where we are here today. We really like to measure our success on the impacts The number of trees that we're planting is one thing, but also the number of connections we're making, meaningful connections with people, and the actions that we're able to help you all take to improve your own communities and your own neighborhoods and nature. So that's really kind of my general overview. And here's my pep talk. We need you. We need you to build planting projects in your own communities. We need you to support our operations. Our nursery wouldn't be what it is without the volunteers that come out religiously to help us grow the seedlings into the plants that we deliver to communities every year. We need you to plant those trees with us in areas where we don't have volunteers to plant them. And then we need you to take what you've learned and then put that into your own landscape in your backyard. Share your knowledge with your neighbors and your church groups and your friends and your grandkids or whoever. Join the local tree board in your community. But what our goal with the Tree Keeper program is really to give you the knowledge about trees, to build your own confidence so that you can be an extension of what we are in your community, so that you can kind of give a little bit more of a voice to those leafy green oxygen machines that are so great for our planet. And with that, I will pass the torch over to Mark Grueber. And I know you read a little bit about his bio, but I will just say on a personal note, Mark's been a leader in community forestry and a mentor of mine for really the past 20 years. He teaches a similar presentation that he's going to give to you all to an urban forestry course through the Merrimack Community College that I work with him on. So take advantage of his knowledge and this opportunity to pick his brain. Don't be shy about throwing some curveballs at him because he can handle it. All right, that's all I have. Thank you again so much for spending your evenings with us for the next 6 weeks. We value everything that you do and appreciate your time.
All right, folks. So we are going to jump into tree biology. And for the next hour and maybe and a half or maybe a little bit more, we are going to blow through a whole lot of information. So Mark, if you don't mind, how about if I throw you a little bit of a curveball rather than waiting till the end? If you have some questions that you can't answer, I'll try to stop like maybe every 10 minutes or so because there's so much stuff here. And just see if there's any questions that I can hit at the time because this is a ton of information to go through. So I'm afraid if we wait till the end, it might be a little overwhelming for folks. So if you don't mind, I'll do it that way if that works for you.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a good plan.
Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
That's kind of, yeah.
Fantastic. And don't freak out if you see slides like this that have a whole bunch of words on them. A lot of this stuff, and maybe this is not the way you're supposed to put a professional presentation together, but a lot of this stuff on these slides, honestly, is to remind me of what I need to talk to you guys about. So, and as Meredith said, I use a version of this PowerPoint for a whole lot of different classes, not just tree keepers. So there's some stuff I'm going to gloss over and won't talk about much at all. There'll be some terms that you see in there that might start to get a little overwhelming. Don't get caught up with those. I'm going to try to make it relatable and real to you. And there's no reason for you guys to really get down deep in the weeds on some of this stuff. So, but if you have questions, feel free, fire them away. And as long as we're not going too slowly, I'll try to address everything we can, or Mark can handle it. So basically we're going to talk about all the different parts of the tree and how they function. That's essentially what this slide says. I do have a test at the end if we have enough time, which I doubt we'll have enough time, and it's going to be hard to do a test with an internet presentation anyway, but we'll see what we're going to do. Down towards the bottom of that, you see that there is something called CODIT, compartmentalization of decay in trees. I'm going to spend a little time on that. I suspect you've got a pruning class where you'll talk about that more, but this is a very important process that trees go through to respond to wounds of various kinds. Pruning does create a type of a wound. So we're going to talk about how trees react to wounds. and some of the internal biology and chemistry that goes on, because this is not really well understood. And honestly, there's a lot of horrible information out there that would that this hopefully will help correct for you as to how trees work. And if we've got an extra minute or two, we might talk some about palms, but it's not going to be a big deal. So usually at this point, I throw this picture up to the class and I ask them to talk a little bit about what they see in these slides, since that's not really an option available to us feasibly for a presentation like this. What I want to mention is understand that this is various environments, ecosystems, if you will, in Missouri where trees grow. Trees naturally grow. We have a forest there on the left with my little puppy dog bouncing around in the fall color. We have a woodland on the right, which if you see the smoke and the fire burning. That fire was a big influencer, was and is to a much lesser extent now, but a big influencer on the woodlands and forests that we have in Missouri. And up top is one of our savanna areas, which essentially, think of it this way, as trees with prairie grasses and prairie wildflowers underneath. That's essentially what it is. And a lot of those savannas were in areas where the rainfall and other factors and natural burning fires kind of created an in-between area between those prairies of northern Missouri and the plains out to the west of us. As those fires kind of crashed into trees, then you'd get kind of some of these savanna areas. So woodlands and forests are by far and away what we have the most of in their natural conditions in Missouri. So why am I wasting time talking about this? Well, you guys probably recognize these as various landscapes. Maybe you have one like the one in that upper left-hand picture where you do the pretty cross-cut lawn mowing. I hope you don't, because I might berate you somewhat through this presentation. I'll try to be kind about it. But we stick trees in these environments, right? And where on earth do any of these environments naturally occur? I'll answer that question for you. It's nowhere. Even prairie grasses or savanna grasses have very different root systems than turf grasses. So we stick trees in these environments and we expect them to grow just like they do in their natural environments. And what we're going to talk about tonight is why that doesn't happen, and the basis of how we prune and plant and do all the various maintenance activities for trees, and hopefully why we do those. Because we take trees from their natural environment, stick them in very unnatural environments, and expect the same kind of reactions, which is ridiculous. It's ludicrous. So I used this slide in so many of my presentations. I'm a real fan of the gentleman who's quoted down at the bottom. I won't read it to you. I'll let you guys read that. But Dr. Alex Shigo was a research biologist with the Forest Service for many years, then went off on his own and really rewrote modern arboriculture, which is how we, maintain trees, really how we plant, maintain trees. And what he found is that so much of the way trees were being maintained, planted and maintained, was based on no science whatsoever. It was based on the way it's been done. It was done for many, many years, which of course we realize doesn't make it right. Doesn't always make it wrong, but doesn't make it right either. So he put all this stuff to the test, and he went out and did all these different things and rewrote, as I said, at how we really plant and prune and maintain trees, but also did a lot of in-depth research on tree biology. And so a lot of what you're going to hear tonight is all based on research that he did, which really wasn't well known before about 25, 30 years ago. Not to the depth. Some of it was known, don't get me wrong, it's not brand new, but not to the depth of the research that he had done. So again, what it's basically saying is we're taking trees from their natural systems and putting them in systems that they don't know. And I'm not trying to make them into thinking organisms, they're not. But we're putting them in sites that they're not adapted to. They have not had the time to evolve with those systems. So they're naturally going to have struggles, and we're naturally going to have to come in and do some maintenance activities. And hopefully that's what this is going to show you. So he was big on definitions, and so am I, but again, can't really fire these questions at you guys, so I'll just answer them for you. What is a tree? Well, I like his definition. It is a woody, long-lived, compartmentalizing perennial. Okay, so trees and shrubs are both woody and compartmentalizing. Long-lived really kind of takes many of the shrubs out of the equation, but you see we're starting to get kind of subjective there. And there's a lot of gray area. What's a large shrub? What's a small tree? But focus in on the woody part. They have bark, they have wood, and they're compartmentalizing, which again, we're going to talk about down the road a little bit. And I've gone through a lot of this other stuff, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. We're going to jump right into plant parts and this magical term called meristems. And don't be so caught up on that term. What I want you to just understand is meristems are growth points. All right, they're areas where the tree is going to put on growth. And we have, this is a cross section of a twig, and we have a node or a growth point that I've just drawn this ugly circle around, which is usually called the apical meristem, or at the tip of a shoot. So at every tip of every branch, no matter how small that branch is, there's this apical meristem, and that is a growth point. Growth begins there, okay? So, and the other meristematic tissue, or the other growth tissue that we have, kind of runs here. Since we have a cross-sectional area, you'll see it around the sides. But again, imagine this is a roundish twig, right? You can see I don't draw very well. So this is wrapping around the twig. So these meristems, the lateral meristems, increase twigs, roots, all the woody structures of the tree in size. The apical meristems initiate growth from the tips. All right. Again, just growth points. Why is that important? Well, usually at this point, I ask people this really hard math question. If we have a tree that has a branch, center of the branch that comes off the ground at 1 foot, and 5 years later, assume the tree grows 1 foot per year. 5 years later, how far off the ground will the center of that branch be? And again, since we really I can't fire that out to you guys, I'd probably get an overwhelming number of responses. Understand that the center of that branch does not gain any distance off the ground. It is not a growth point, right? The growth points are at the tips. So that center of that branch is going to stay 1 foot off the ground. It will always be 1 foot off the ground. Who cares? Why is that important? Well, it's important because if you plant a tree out in your yard and you're planning on maintaining some turf underneath that tree, don't imagine that that branch is going to elevate magically off of the ground and 5 years down the road be 5 feet or 6 feet off the ground. Actually, if I do my math correctly, it won't be. It's still going to be 1 foot off the ground. Okay. So again, tips of twigs, tips of roots, and then circling, going around the outside of every single branch, every part of that woody structure, the trunk, the branches, the roots, are the lateral meristems, increasing things in size, generally like 1 growth ring per year, right? All right, let me get off my drawing here. Okay, and this is, again, just kind of a, oops. I should get rid of my drawing. So you guys aren't looking at that awful purple. All right, there's just a cross section of a trunk. And again, usually at this point, I have some wood samples that I have people looking at, which makes this a lot more real to folks when they can see a cross section of a trunk of a tree. But imagine that you walked out to your yard. Don't do this, but take your chainsaw and cut your tree down. You're looking at this stump, or you take a little tree cookie, as we call it, cross section of that trunk. And obviously where it says cuticle, don't worry about that, but look where it says bark on the left-hand side of that diagram. That's the outer part of the tree. And this is moving from the outside of the tree, as we're up here at the top of that diagram, down towards the center of the tree. And again, don't get caught up in all the terminology here. It's not that important. I'm going to point out a couple of things, which I want you guys to kind of remember. They're the important ones. And let me get to my little drawer here. So I want you guys to, obviously, we're going to talk about bark some more. Oops. Well, I'm not drawing now. Okay, well, we're going to talk about bark some more. We're going to talk about the cork cambium just a little bit. And then we're also going to talk about phloem, which you see to the right-hand side, in towards the center of that, or the lower right-hand side of that diagram. And then we're also going to talk about xylem as well. Those are the important structures that I want you guys to just have a bit of an understanding of what they do and how they function. They're probably the most important parts in this entire picture. And here they are right here. So the cambium is basically the meristematic tissue, that lateral meristematic tissue that I talked about a couple slides ago. That's what creates these new tissues of xylem and phloem each and every year. Phloem is always produced to the outside, so right up against the bark of the tree, and xylem is the wood, really, that's created to the inside, in towards the center of the tree. So every piece of wood furniture, every piece of wood that you've ever seen, which you're actually holding in your hands, if you were holding a piece of furniture, is xylem, okay? Wood is all xylem cells. And what xylem does is move water and minerals that are dissolved in that water, obviously up through the root system and up and out through the leaves of the tree, okay? So xylem generally moves, you can call it one direction, and it's not completely up, right? Because if you have a branch that's at a 90-degree angle to the trunk of the tree, it's moving it out. But think of it being drawn up through the root system, up the trunk, and then out the branches, all right? That's the direction that xylem moves. These water and dissolved minerals. It cannot move water the other direction. It has no physical ability to do that. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. Phloem is what moves the energy that's created in the leaves. And again, we'll go over this more in greater detail coming up. Moves the energy that's created in the leaves to where it's needed in the tree. We call that moving it from source to sink. So where it's generated, typically in the leaves, to where it's needed in the tree. So phloem can move multiple directions, all right? And again, the dominant thing is from where it's created to where it's needed in the tree. That's the important part of that movement. The cambium tissues, or vascular cambium, you'll hear it called, is what creates those tissues every year. Xylem always laid to the inside, phloem always made to the outside, up against the trunk of the tree. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one at all. Just really want to show you and talk about really one of my pet peeves is when I hear arborists or foresters say, well, trees are like people in that. You know what? No, they're not, because we're really not alike much at all. We're very, very different creatures. And if you're familiar at all with the way organisms are classified, if you remember back to your high school or middle school biology, you probably were taught kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Well, we have plants and animal kingdoms, right? And now kind of another one, but we're not going to get into that. But they're in two different kingdoms. The highest level of generality there is in that classification process, plants, animals. The way plants react to things and the way people react to things, animals react to things, are very, very different. And primarily that's based on the cell architecture, all right? They have a different cell architecture than what people have. And that's the takeaway from that slide. We don't need to worry about anything else. Again, a lot of overwhelming text on this one. I just want you guys to key in on kind of the upper part of the text. And that's the functioning, what the function of xylem is. Like we talked about before, it moves water in the dissolved minerals in that water, it is there for structural support. It's what holds the tree up, right? We talked about xylem being wood. So it is part of the physical structure that holds the branches, holds the branches hold the leaves, right? So that's xylem is there to beef up that structure. There is some energy reserve that occurs in xylem cells. But one of the important things to understand, and again, we'll touch on this here in a little bit, is as you move from the outside of the trunk or larger branches or even smaller branches, in some cases, you move towards the outside, so right up next to the bark, and you start moving in towards the center of that trunk or branch, the functionality of those xylem cells decreases rapidly. And we're going to talk about coming up here something called functioning sapwood and heartwood, which is really going to reinforce that. But your heartwood, which you're really talking about most of the time, a trunk and the larger branches have heartwood in them. You're talking about tissues that are there for really structural support. They're holding things up, and any other functionality really doesn't exist anymore. And then xylem actually will function as part of this compartmentalization process that we talked about, or we're going to talk about, I should say. Mark, how about if I stop there? People good on xylem and phloem and movement of stuff?
Yeah, that's perfect. Actually, we just had a question that I thought you might be able to field. So
Sure.
when you were talking about communication, someone asked, don't plants communicate? And I know I've seen actually I feel like I've seen more about this in some science publications recently about, particularly communication through root systems, communication with hormones and
Right.
terpenes
Yeah.
and things like that. So do you want to just maybe address that for a minute?
Sure. Yeah, that's that's one of those fun questions I get a lot, and it honestly it depends on how you define communication. And I'm not gonna go down that pathway because Lord of mercy, we'd be here all night. But there's evidence. There's actually evidence that's decades old, where they studied a group of pines in a pine forest down south that were being attacked by a particular insect called Ips beetle. And as this beetle was moving through this stand of pines, what they were able to show was that out in front of the insect front, movement front, if you want to call it that, beyond that, the trees that hadn't been attacked yet were reacting, trying to beef up their defenses in preparation of the insects moving through the trees. So through there's hormonal triggers, if you will, that Mark was kind of talking about there a second ago. The trees in the unaffected area were responding to the hormones given off by the trees inside of the infected area. So you want to call that communication? I'm not going to argue with you on it, because again, I think it just depends on how you want to define that term. But they were reacting to these hormonal triggers, trying to build up their defenses to do the best that they could to withstand the attack from these particular insects. There's evidence now and been talked about in some books that have been a little popular, that, in my opinion, start to get away from science, and the science gets a little gray. But again, there's the mycorrhizal activity in the roots, which we're going to talk about. I keep saying this, but we're going to talk about again here in a few minutes. These fungi that have this symbiotic relationships with root systems in trees, apparently, again, are doing some communication, if you will, between trees, usually of similar species. I don't know that there's been strong evidence of trees between unrelated species reacting to sources of water and minerals and things like that. But Yeah, arguably yes is the short answer to that question, but that's really kind of the biology behind it, which again I think you'll kind of understand here coming up a little bit more. Anything else?
One other. Yeah,
Yep.
we have one more. This one's
Sure.
a little more straightforward. So, does the older internal xylem become more structurally rigid, or is it just that it loses its function as water transport?
Yeah, not necessarily more rigid. Um, and that's kind of a generalization because there's going to be some variation in moisture amounts and things like that. So you could argue it might gain or lose some rigidity based on the moisture that's in the wood cells. But again, that's going pretty deep down a rabbit hole. So generally, and in the broadest term, no, it's just that the functionality of transport and the functionality of that tissue to do the compartmentalization, which we'll discuss at length, is diminished or doesn't even exist. Sometimes you'll read that tissue is considered dead, non-functional. It doesn't matter to me which terms you use, but again, just the important thing to understand is as you move towards the center of the tree, functionality of that xylem tissue just is not there anymore. The other part. Oh yeah, shoot.
No, you're good. Doesn't it become the heartwood? So you just maybe want to
Yes.
clarify. Yeah.
Yes, and we're going to have a diagram of that coming up, so I'll point that out here in a second. Understand that you see the terms gymnosperms and angiosperms. Think conifers or quote unquote evergreens, but you have to be careful with that when you use that term evergreen. Angiosperms are the trees that lose their leaves in the fall. Generally, this is nature, so there are no absolutes or few absolutes, I guess I should say. There are conifers, deciduous conifers. Bald cypress is a pretty common one that people know. Larch is another one, or tamarack. Dawn redwood, if you're familiar with that. They have needles, but they lose those needles in the fall. So they're considered deciduous conifers, but your deciduous trees generally are angiosperms. Your evergreens generally are gymnosperms. And just understand that the way the xylem is structured and the way they move water is different. Angiosperms, again, generally are much more efficient at moving water, pumping water through them. It's more of almost a series of straws or pipes all connected together that are pumping water up through the tree. And that's really a poor description, as you're going to hear me talk about a little bit later on. In your conifers, it's really more of these tissues are kind of slightly offset, so it's not a direct pipeline. So they're not quite as efficient at moving water. And that was really shown, if you guys remember the drought of 2012 around here. Eastern white pine really took it on the chin during that drought period, and actually for several years after, because they just could not pump enough water efficiently. Now we can get into the fact that Eastern white pine is not native to this part of the world, native to Missouri at all. I saw that there were some people from Illinois, but it's really native to Northern Illinois. We do see it planted a lot in the landscape, but understand that's, when you've got something that's not native or indigenous to those areas, you're going to have situations where these events are going to come in and stress the tree, and that might be enough to take that tree out with some opportunistic things piling on, whereas a native species still going to go under stress, but it may be able to withstand that stress better. And that's just one of those examples that was based on really just the xylem structure, how the water moves up in a tree. All right, so here's our sapwood and heartwood. That's kind of down at the bottom, but since there's been some questions on that, we'll talk about that now. And again, the quality of that picture is not great, but your sapwood is to the outside. It's usually a few layers, underneath the bark of the tree. This will really vary in size based on the species of the tree. And if you ever see a cross section of a trunk of a tree like this, you'll see that there's an area that's lighter in color, and it can vary from just a few millimeters of light colored tissue, and then it goes to a darker color, which is your heartwood. So the sapwood is functioning xylem. It's the xylem that still has function left to it, where it's pumping water. You might have some heartwood tissues that still are doing some energy storage that the tree can rely upon, but the functionality is dramatically reduced. So if you were going to compare, say, a cross section of a post oak, it's one of my favorite trees. I got a big giant one in my backyard, so you can hear me talk about it a lot. Meredith is smiling because she's heard those stories before. To say a cottonwood, eastern cottonwood. Cottonwoods are massive water pumps. They just have a whole bunch of functioning sapwood. If you take a cross section of equal size, and I usually have a couple of these wood pieces to show you, show up at the nursery for some work days. I bet Mark's got some samples he could show this to you on. You're going to see a huge amount of functioning sapwood in that cottonwood piece. And it might be, say, we've got 2 samples that are 12 inches across. And in that cottonwood piece, you may see 5 growth rings, and that's it. And it's all this light colored wood. And you may not see much, if at all, in the way of any heartwood, because those things are they are adapted to pump water. It's what they do. And that post oak, that 12-inch cross-sectional area of post oak, may have 100 growth rings in it because they grow really, really slowly, and they grow on sites that are usually drier and have poor soil. So they don't put on a lot of lateral growth. Those lateral meristems that we talked about don't increase that tree in size very much each year. And they might just have just a couple millimeters of that light colored functioning sapwood that is doing all the water pumping for that post oak, and the rest of that xylem tissue, the inner part of the wood of that tree, is all heartwood. And again, there's no functionality for water pumping, maybe a little energy storage that the tree can rely upon if it needs it, but it's there to hold the tree up. And again, it's really a function of the environment that these trees are naturally found in, how they've adapted and compete in those settings that they're in. Just touch on that going back to xylem, there are these 2 broad categories of xylem structure: ring porous trees and diffuse porous trees. The only reason why I'm going to point that out here is if you're as much of a tree nerd as I am, and the 2 other foresters that are on this phone call tonight, or this internet presentation tonight. If you're doing some diagnosis on how trees react to different things, maybe a pest issue or a stress issue of drought, like we talked about in 2012, you'll see some differences in how these trees will react to these stresses. So a ring porous tree, the thing to understand about that, and you can see these groups of trees that are in that category. We'll pick on oaks because I love oaks. I'm an oakophile. If you have a root system that's growing out to the east side of the face of the tree, that root generally is going to draw water and minerals and feed up through the tissues to a branch that is on that same face of the tree. There's a pretty direct relationship between the roots on that side of the tree and the branches on that side of the tree. In a diffuse porous tree, there is more movement laterally of those materials. So a branch on the east face of the tree may not directly be pumping water and moving energy to branches on that same face. So if you were to cut those roots, God forbid, and damage the tree's ability to move water and minerals, you might see a branch on that oak on that same side of the tree react to that, drop its leaves turn color, maybe drop off, branch maybe dies if the root loss is severe enough. In a diffuse porous tree, if you cut that branch and the damage is severe enough, you will probably see a reaction kind of sporadic throughout the tree. You may see a decline overall. You may see a couple of tips die back in the top. So understanding that can help you with some diagnosis. Am I looking at a maple, for instance, which is diffuse porous, how is it going to respond to root loss versus an oak? They're going to respond differently. It's important to understand. All right, let's move on to that one. Talk about phloem. This is what's moving our energy that's created. All right, and energy is created in the leaves. And as we talked about, it's moved from source to sink. And the big thing to understand, don't worry about the different types. It's really not that important for you guys to know, but it is moving carbohydrates, sugars that are produced, photosynthesis, and it's moving it from where it's created to where it's needed in the tree or shrub. These are woody plants that this biology will be good for. And as we talked about, old xylem is the wood of the tree. Old phloem is actually crushed as that new layer of phloem is created. Remember I said it's always created to the outside. Well, what happens to the old stuff then? Well, it's actually crushed and either assimilated or turned into bark tissue, or it's actually turned into the new phloem tissue. It becomes part of the new phloem layer that's laid down as well. So since that, you have the phloem tissue to the outside, you have the vascular cambium in the middle, and then you have all xylem on the inside. Remember, all wood is xylem. So as that vascular tissue, vascular cambium lays that phloem tissue to the outside, it just gets crushed into these new tissues that get put down each and every year. These cool little structures, and these are fascinating to look at if you have some wood samples, maybe you got a chunk of wood in front of you, even a board, maybe look at the end of it and you'll see these almost spokes on a wheel type of thing that are moving out from what would be the center of the trunk of the tree or the center of a branch of a tree out to the outside. So you can see in the picture where it says phloem, and you see that arrow pointing to that tissue that runs kind of perpendicular, to that, almost, not quite, but you see 4 or 5 other similar type of structures, look like spokes to me of a wheel, and that's generally what they look like. So the ray tissues are there when the tree has to rely on that energy storage that we talked about in the functioning sapwood, maybe moving into the heartwood. The ray cells are going to help the tree move energy that is stored in that heartwood and functioning sapwood out to the phloem tissue, so the phloem tissue can then move it to where it needs it. Remember, source to sink. So why is that important? Again, think about, say you have a crabapple tree, and say eastern tent caterpillar comes along, real common insect that we have in the area, has really variable in its populations, but every few years we'll get a really nice outbreak because the weather has really favored the insect, maybe the predators, the birds that the warblers primarily, which feed upon them. Maybe they moved through a little early and didn't really decimate the population like they usually do a great job of. So maybe we had a lot of eggs laid, and we have a really good outbreak. An eastern tent caterpillar comes out in the springtime just as leaves are being put on your fruit trees and ornamental fruit trees like crabapple and some other ones. So the crabapple trying to put out its set of leaves, and eastern tent caterpillar munch, eats all the leaves off of the tree. What does the tree do? Leaves are the energy makers, as we're going to talk about here in a little bit. The tree has to rely on this energy storage, and that's when these ray cells are triggered. So they start drawing the energy that's stored, in that, again, what's left of that functioning heartwood that can actually move the energy out of those cells into the rays, and the functioning sapwood moves it along these rays to the phloem, which is just a layer to the outside right underneath the bark, and then it can be moved to whatever parts of the tree needs it to initiate growth of new leaves. And that's how woody plants put on another set of leaves. If, like I said, eastern tent caterpillar, or say drought, whatever overwatering causes the leaves to drop off, the tree can flush another set of leaves, drawing on these energy reserves that it has. And the rays are really responsible for transportation of that. They do some coated stuff too, but we're going to hit coated later. All right, keep saying later. I promise we're going to get there. Hang with me. Bark is protective tissue, pretty common, also moderates temperature and water loss, and that's really the important thing to understand. The very outer bark, again, it's non-functional. It's that old phloem that's been crushed and assimilated into bark tissue to the outside. And on certain species of trees, this happens to be a honey locust here, but you'll really see it on cherries as well. You'll see these white elliptical, you can see the blue arrow pointing to it, kind of elliptical shapes, smashed football shapes, if you want to think of it that way. And those are little openings in the bark where some gas exchange actually will occur. And you see that this stem of this honey locust kind of has kind of an olive greenish color to it. Well, it actually, because it's got some of the green pigment that's important to photosynthesis, it actually exists in some of the bark cells of this tree. You can actually get some energy creation. It's very, very minor, but you can get some energy creation in the bark sometimes of trees that have a little bit of green coloration to the bark tissues. And that these lenticels, there has to be gas exchange, which we're going to talk about, right? Because trees are taking in carbon dioxide and pushing out oxygen when they're photosynthesizing, when they're creating energy. There has to be something there to allow that gas to move back and forth. And that's one of the things that lenticels do. So really pronounced, like I said, on honey locust and on cherry. All right, let's look at our twig tip again, just talk about stems somewhat. Remember that terminal bud that's out at the tip of that twig, and at each bud that you see on here, those are called nodes or growth points, all right? There is meristematic tissue there, right, that causes that bud to grow out or to initiate growth of a leaf or a flower or what have you, right? So every tip of every twig has got an apical meristem on it, and then wrapped around the outside, right beneath the bark, is our lateral meristem, which is going to increase the girth or the thickness of that twig, branch, or trunk. Again, what's the importance to these things? Well, besides being growth points, there's this thing called apical dominance. And that basically means that there are hormones along with energy that's stored just behind each one of those buds, each one of those nodes, those growth points, which is going to initiate. Imagine this is winter, okay? This twig that we're looking at, it's wintertime, and it's coming up to spring, and it's going to get ready to initiate growth of leaves and new shoots and flowers. Well, I hear a lot of times people talk about, especially folks that are tapping sugar maples, and I'm sure there's going to be some folks which are going to jump on this one, that tap maples for maple syrup. There's this idea that there's all this energy created in the top of a tree during the growing season, and then in the fall it takes all that energy and moves it all the way down into the root system, and then in the spring it grabs that energy and moves it all the way back up to the top of the tree from the farthest extents of the root systems. If you are a functioning living organism and it costs you energy to move energy, that's the most inefficient process imaginable. And that's not what happens. Yes, there is downward movement of sap, okay? That's how we can do the sugar maple tapping, but the energy that is stored to initiate growth in each one of those growth points is stored directly behind the growth point. If you don't believe me, go outside, maybe not right now, but go outside after this presentation's over, clip a twig, take a really, really sharp knife, do not cut yourself, but cut that twig long ways, cut it longitudinally, all right? So you're cutting that thing in half from the terminal bud down to the end of the twig that you cut off. Take some iodine, if you have some, and stain the wood that you've exposed with that iodine. What that does is it turns a darker reddish brown color where carbohydrates, starch reserves are. How does a tree store its energy? Carbohydrates. Sugars are created through photosynthesis. It stores through carbohydrates. What you'll find is behind each one of those growth points, you'll get and you'll have to cut a live twig. If you cut a dead twig, this is not going to work. But if you cut a live twig, you're going to see dark brown staining right behind each one of those growth points. And why is this important? Why am I going through this? Well, one of the most common things we hear when we're trying to diagnose a tree problem for someone is, my tree came out and looked pretty and green in the springtime, and when it got hot and dry in the summertime, all of a sudden it blew all of its leaves. All the leaves came off. It died all at once in the summer. Well, it actually didn't. What was affecting that tree could have been affecting it for a long period of time. By that, I mean multiple years, because the energy that's important for growth, right? New growth in the springtime is stored right behind those growth points. So it doesn't have to move it very far. So you could have something that blocked all the tissue that moves water in the tree, and it doesn't show up until later because it's spring. There's generally plenty of water. Trees aren't moving a whole heck of a lot of water. The energy stored to initiate all that growth is stored right behind the buds. So the tissue that moves that energy doesn't have to move it very far. Tree comes out, looks great. And then weeks, month, 2 months later, all of a sudden the tree dropped all its leaves. But you're seeing delayed symptoms because once it starts to get hot and dry, that's when the functionality of that xylem pumping water and minerals becomes really important. The other thing is that I kind of glossed over and need to talk about a little bit more is the apical dominance. There's also hormones behind each one of these buds as well, and especially at the tips of any of these twigs. And what happens with these balances of hormones in these twigs and all throughout the tree is at the tip of that twig, the hormones there kind of control growth to influence new shoot growth from that terminal bud, all right, the tip of the bud at the tip of the twig to initiate shoot growth there. That becomes dominant, all right? The tree's gonna put most of its energy into shooting out a bunch of, a length of new growth from that growth point. And the tip of that little tiny twig that comes off at the lower left is gonna put some on too, but it won't be as much because the dominance is at the tip of this bigger twig right now, the apical dominance. There is some apical dominance again in that tip of that small twig as well. But behind these other buds that you see, leaf buds growing along the branch, there's little to no apical dominance there, all right? They just put out new leaves. They don't put out new shoot growth. And that's because of this collection of hormones this balance of hormones, I guess I should say more correctly, is located right behind these buds that are at the tip of the twigs. Again, why am I going through all this with you? Well, because you guys have seen this, and I'm sure as you've played around with even indoor plants, if you've ever busted a bud off the tip of a twig or taken your pruners and said, I don't want that branch to grow any longer, and you've clipped the tip of that branch out, you have severed and played with that hormone imbalance, right? So you've removed those hormones. Now all of a sudden that apical dominance to that twig is lost. And the tree is going to initiate growth of these other buds, and maybe this other smaller twig in the lower left of this diagram here, that's going to take over as apical dominance. So someone who really has to do a lot of pruning, if you understand how this whole process works, you can direct growth in a tree. The greatest example I can give to you of this that I'm sure a lot of you have seen, and maybe I'll bet you weren't thinking apical dominance when you walked through there, but if you ever go to the Japanese garden at the Missouri Botanical Garden, that is, and bonsai is the same thing. That is playing with apical dominance. What you're doing is making small, tiny, frequent little cuts to direct growth of a tree in those two formats, and for an artistic form, right? But you can do this in every day. If you've got a branch that's growing in a direction you don't want it to, prune that branch back, remove that dominant apical bud, and you're going to initiate growth in another direction. Now, what's important and what you're going to get into in way more detail in pruning class, so we're not going to hit this anymore here, is being smart on which direction then the tree is going to initiate that growth. You can direct it if you are a very smart pruner, but you guys are going to go through that more. But understand that's how that process works. There's apical dominance in these hormones. All right,
Mark,
quickly here, we're going to, yep.
Just a quick note, we actually do have Ben Chu, who is in charge of maintenance at the Japanese garden, teaching the pruning class. So I'm excited to hear that, because
you couldn't get a better person to do it. He absolutely is. Absolutely.
Very excited to hear from
you
him.
You guys are lucky. That's going to be an awesome class. He's a great guy. the point I want to show you here is that tiny little kind of pointy thing that looks like it's pointing out, almost trying to rupture out through the bark there, something that called an adventitious bud. There's these buds that lay dormant up and down the trunk and main branches of throughout the tree that are dormant and are not triggered unless the tree needs them for some reason. And usually that's a couple of things. If the tree goes under stress, one of the things the tree will do is it needs to create more energy for itself. So it's going to put out more leaves because the leaves are the energy factories. So it's going to trigger some of these buds to create more leaf surface to attempt to create more energy. So it's going to expend some energy in hopes to create more to put in defenses to kind of ward off whatever's causing the stress, if it possibly can. The other thing where you might have seen this is, say you had two trees growing together and one is removed because it dies, or your neighbor cut it down or something like that. And all of a sudden, boy, all these twigs just kind of sprout out in that side of the tree that was shaded by that tree planted nearby or growing nearby. The tree's responding to the fact that there's now a greater amount of sunlight exposure in that area that it wasn't exposed to before. Trees are opportunistic organisms. They're going to jump at the chance to create more energy, because if they're not growing, they're dying. So they will absolutely trigger these buds to get out as much leaf surface as possible to maximize energy creation. Okay. And just understand that these buds are there. And if you start to see this, I call it a fuzzy kind of pipe cleaner look. If you see a lot of these small twigs growing out of the main trunk or main branches, some people will call them water sprouts, there's an issue. That's letting you know there's some kind of issue. It may be, that issue may be that it's just got some increased sunlight exposure that it didn't have, but oftentimes there's a stressor related to that. So it's important to understand that you can then start to figure out, okay, my tree's telling me something here, and hopefully you can work on figuring out what it is. I talked about this. I'm not going to hit the nodes and internodes anymore. Just again, the nodes are the growth points wherever there's a bud, whether it's a tip, whether it's a side of the twig, that's a node, a growth point, and the area in between those, obviously enough, is called the internode. You don't need to know that. Here's the big takeaway from this diagram is the bottom point on this slide. So again, a lot of people don't understand. I know a lot of arborists that don't understand this as well. But just pick up on this part of it, is the energy created in a branch rarely leaves that branch. So the leaves are creating energy throughout the year. And again, there's this thought that there's this huge movement throughout the tree. There's not. There really isn't. It's stored as close to it possibly can be to the point where the tree needs it. Right? It doesn't want to have to move energy great distances because it costs a lot of energy to do that. It's losing so much energy along the way. It wants to try to store it as close as it can to the point where it will possibly need it. So there is some movement into the trunk, into the root system, and storage in those places. But most of the energy created in that branch, I'm going to say it again because repetition is the key to learning. The energy created in a branch rarely leaves that branch. All right, it's very important you understand that. And so when you're looking at your tree and you start to see the tree is developing some deadwood towards the bottom of the tree, or maybe on a side of the tree where there's another adjacent tree growing that's kind of encroaching on it, and there's a lot more shade there as those two trees have increased in size, all of a sudden there's deadwood showing up there all of a sudden. People will say, well, all of a sudden I've got deadwood in my tree and I don't really understand why. Well, trees are sun-loving organisms. Sun is what creates energy in the tree. And so when parts of the tree don't have the exposure to sunlight that they did, the tree's going to cut it off because that branch is not, again, energy, it's relatively self-sustaining, but if it's not contributing to the whole, the tree basically cuts it off. You're done. You're not contributing to the whole. You start to become a sink. Remember, energies move from source to sink. So instead of being a source, you're now a sink, and you're costing the rest of the organism energy that I have to move from other places into that branch. You can't create enough to sustain yourself. You're done. You're cut off. Go by the wayside. So the more sun-loving trees are, and there's variability in that. Dogwoods are a great example of a shade species, very shade-tolerant species. Oaks are sun-loving species. If they don't have a huge amount of sunlight, they're gonna put on dead wood. They're really gonna be negatively impacted by that. So you'll see trees that limb themselves up, we call it, which means they're just shedding their lower branches as they grow bigger and bigger because those bottom branches are naturally getting shaded. Pines are another great example of that. Our native shortleaf pine, you'll end up a shortleaf pine that's 50 or 60 years old. You'll end up with a tree that has a tuft of vegetation in the upper 10 feet and then about 70 or 80 feet of trunk and dead branches because they need a lot of sunlight. So they will basically shed all those lower limbs naturally because they're not creating enough energy to contribute to the whole. All right, branch attachment. I'm going to go through this quickly because, again, you're going to see this a lot, and the Ben Chu is going to talk about this a whole bunch. But once you understand how branch attachment works in a tree, and I really, really wish that I had wood samples in front of you to show you this. If you ever split firewood, boy, you can really see this sometimes. If you get maybe splitting a piece that's got a knot in it, and it splits long ways along that knot. A lot of times you can see, well, holy cow, that branch that's on there, man, it was initiated 5, 6, 7 inches in towards the center of that tree. That's where the growth of that branch first started. Because remember, we have the lateral meristems, right? Wrapping around the branch, wrapping around the trunk. Each one is increasing in girth every year. The branch increases in size, the trunk increases in size. So the trunk overlaps or grows around another layer every year around that branch. Each year the branch increases in size, starts to get a little bit thicker. The tree responds by putting girth on. The trunk responds by putting girth and increasing in size based on the weight and stress loading that occurs on that branch. And it's an amazing structural system when you look at it and you see the overlapping tissues that occur in those areas. It's fascinating to see how they interlace and overlap, and it makes you wonder how branches fail. Why do branches that have leaves on them, why do they break off? Because something's happened to that fantastic structural integrity of the organisms in that area, of that tissue in that area that's affected the overlapping of that tissue, maybe decayed it away or weakened it somehow. But this structure is very, very strong. That's how limbs that can weigh, you think of some of our biggest trees, giant sequoias and coastal redwoods, branches that can weigh tens of tons can be supported, that can have tens of tons of weight on them, just on the branch, are being able to be supported by these trunks. And it's connectivity of tissues and this increasing in size every year. And the other thing to understand is where that happens. You can see that kind of red dotted semicircular line. That area is called the branch collar. So that is actually trunk tissue. Remember, the trunk's increasing in width every year. It's wrapping a layer of tissue around that branch. Well, that kind of swollen area there, known as the branch collar, is trunk tissue. And you're going to find out how important that is in the compartmentalization process coming up. But it's very important for pruning because you never want to damage trunk tissue. You only want to cut branch tissue. If you cut into that branch collar, you really damage the tree's ability to naturally ward off decay organisms. If you make your branch or your cut just outside that branch collar, that's where you're making your cut at the best place for the tree to respond to that wound and prevent decay organisms from moving into the tree. We're going to talk about this a lot more. Included bark can be another issue. You see in the upper left where it says branch bark ridge, and you see kind of that pointed, almost pyramidal looking structure right through there. Again, as the branch increases in size, trunk increases in size, and where those tissues overlap, they should hit and roll out to a point like that. And that's why it's called the branch bark ridge, because those tissues meet, hit, and interlace together and roll out. Well, included bark is the opposite of that. Those tissues hit, don't interlace, because bark tissue unfortunately starts to hit bark tissue and they can't intermesh, intertwine, and they hit and they roll inward. And so now each and every year, what happens? The branch increases in size, the trunk of the tree increases in size, and they're literally pushing against each other each and every year. When you see pictures of trees damaged in ice storms, heavy snow loading, heavy windstorms, things like that, a huge amount of the time, this is not a scientific percentage, other than it's based on my anecdotal observations over the god-awful long time I've been doing this. 90+% of the time, what you're looking at is a failure due to an included bark situation in a branch or a trunk of the tree. It happens very, very frequently. Pruning is going to be super important to help deal with those issues when the tree is small. I'm not going to steal any more of Ben's thunder. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Leave you hanging for when Ben talks to you. All right, leaves. Leaves are the energy factories, as we've talked about. These structures called chloroplasts, don't worry about remembering that. But chlorophyll, the green pigment in leaves, it's why leaves are green. That's what absorbs the sunlight. That's where the magic happens. That's where photosynthesis occurs, and the energy of the sun is taken in, and in the presence of water and along with carbon dioxide, then gets turned into sugars and oxygen is given off. All right. The other thing that leaves do, and that's why if you remember, I kind of caught myself a little bit when I talked about how water is being pumped up through the tree. The leaves are really those pumps. They are, because of the water moves from high concentration to low concentration. The leaves are literally pulling water up through the tree. Through the roots are absorbing it, and the leaves are just pulling that water up through, because they're giving water off through transpiration up into the atmosphere where there's usually lower concentrations of water. 2012 was a really interesting year because that was not the case. And water was actually moving the other direction, or trying to. But the leaves are pulling that water up through the tree through that process called transpiration. So they are pumps and they are energy factories. So every time you remove a leaf off of the tree, you're diminishing that tree's or woody plant, you're diminishing, well, actually any plant, you're diminishing that plant's ability to create energy for yourself. You have to understand that, because you're messing with that plant's ability to create energy. And it's going to respond to that if it can. That's why tree topping, removal of a lot of leaf surface is a bad thing for a woody plant, because you're forcing it now to respond. It's got to draw energy in order to get that energy production reestablished. Why don't I pause there for some questions if there are any, Mark?
Yeah, we have just two.
Perfect.
Hold on, let me get back to one. So I'm not exactly sure what this one's asking, but so how do trees' cambium tissues regulate the magnitude of the growth of xylem versus phloem, since xylem are disproportionately larger?
Yeah, I think so understand that the xylem is just a new layer, one new layer that's laid down to the outside of the tree every year, as I kind of talked about. And the old xylem just gets crushed or absorbed into the new tissues. There's literally no place for the old phloem tissue to go. It has to be assimilated into bark or turned into new phloem tissues, where the xylem, since it gets laid down to the inside, think of it this way: a tree every year is replicating itself to the outside. Every year it puts on a new tree. Every ring of wood that's put on is a new tree. So it's always added to the outside. Since it's added to the outside, the xylem remains, where the phloem tissue is just crushed and absorbed into something else. If that doesn't answer your question, if that's not where you were going for, maybe try a different tactic, fire it off again, and we'll try to address it.
All right, one more. I already kind of addressed this a little bit too,
Okay.
but someone asked, do trees feel pain?
No.
And my response is basically, what evolutionary function would pain serve an organism that cannot move or defend itself?
Yeah, and they don't really have sensory organs per se. So yeah, there's no way, there's no tissues that recognize pain as we understand it in an organism, the animal type of organism, react to it. Trees don't move, right? They have to be able, they can't go down to the grocery store and buy supplies or go hunting and harvest food, vegetation or living creatures to live off of. They're in one place, they can't get up and walk around and go anywhere. So they got to create the energy where they are. And there's just no need for them to be able to respond to, damage through pain. They respond to damage through this compartmentalization process that we're going to talk about, but it provides them no advantage. Or for us, it's, fight or flight type of thing. Animal kingdom, it's a fight or flight response.
All right, and another one, this is a good one. Why do leaves need to transpire water?
Well, need is really not the correct term. It's the fact that the tree organism has more water in it than what's in the atmosphere outside. So the leaves, even when they close down and try to keep as much moisture, and the bark tissues are there to prevent as much water loss as possible, because there's higher concentrations of water within that tree organism, it's going to lose it naturally to that surrounding atmosphere. So through that process of that water leaving those tissues at whatever rate, sometimes that rate can be really high because the tree is just pumping water like crazy, really trying to move it through. It's really trying to grow. That's part of the growth process as well, photosynthesis process. So those leaves are pumping water because they really are trying to create a lot of energy. Water is used, right, through photosynthesis. It's part of that process. And that gaseous exchange is causing moisture to leave through those tissues at a higher rate. So that water is just being drawn up through because it goes from high concentration to low concentration. Anything else?
That's it for now. Thanks.
All right, let's plow along. We got a lot more to go and not a lot of time to do it. Okay, this is the process we were just talking about. Just understand here in this cross section of a leaf, these stomates or stomata in the plural, that's where this gaseous exchange is going on. When photosynthesis is occurring, that's where it's taking in the carbon dioxide, and it's giving off the oxygen. So the magic happens with photosynthesis, and those kind of kidney bean shaped cells on either side of the stomate there, those are the guard cells, and those open and close. You really want to do a cool experiment, and if you go up to the nursery, you might get an opportunity to actually see this in an area where there's overhead irrigation, or if you have a potted plant maybe growing on your deck and it's July and it's hot and the humidity is maybe a little bit lower than 95%, which is what it usually is here in St. Louis, but say the humidity is a little bit lower that day. And you go out with your hose and you water down the leaves of that plant, thinking that you're cooling it off. You're opening up those guard cells. The tree's responding to that because it's getting some higher humidity. So it says, okay, well, maybe I'm not going to lose a lot of water if I keep these stomates open. So those guard cells start to open up. Well, that water that you sprinkled on those leaves evaporates very quickly, right? In that hot, dry situation, and those guard cells can't close back down fast enough, you'll actually cause what's called scorch, leaf scorch, where those tissues then evaporate so rapidly they die surrounding those guard cells. And you'll see these kind of brown edges to the leaves. So you really have to be careful. You don't want to water foliage. You want to water the soil. You want the water being absorbed through the root system, moving up through the tree that way. Watering the leaves isn't going to do much good at all, especially in that situation. Now, if you do it in the evening time, morning time, it's really probably not going to cause you a whole lot of issues. But avoid bright, dry, hot, sunny days. Avoid watering foliage of your woody plants during that time, or you can cause some leaf score issues, and that's why the garden cells just can't close those pores down enough. Just the only thing I talk about here is the veins in the leaf, or the xylem and the phloem. All right, we talked about those tissues. Xylem moves water and minerals, right? Dissolved minerals, generally one direction, up and out. That's two, but we'll call it one, through the tree. Phloem moves it from source to sink, and the veins have these bundles of xylem and phloem in them. So what happens in the fall? Okay, this is the difference between a deciduous tree and an evergreen tree. As we talked about, generally we think of needled trees as being evergreen. Like we mentioned before, there are some caveats to that. Bald cypress is one, Don redwood, large. They drop their needles. So they are still gymnosperms, but they are deciduous evergreens. Well, the trees that are deciduous, and most of our deciduous trees, angiosperms, form what's called an abscission zone. You can see that in the lower picture. So think about it this way. A tree, the leaf of the tree, as we talked about, that's the energy factory. And what happens as we get towards the fall, well, our day length shortens, right? What's important about day length shortening when it comes to energy creation in those leaves? Well, the day length is short enough that the tree goes, well, okay, it's short enough that the leaf is not creating enough energy. It's not creating more energy than what it's using. So day length has gotten to the point where it's now, I don't want the leaves on there anymore. I don't want photosynthesis going on. It's really not going through this whole long thinking process, but hopefully I'm making it real to you. Those leaves aren't creating enough energy. They'd actually be using more than what they would create. So this abscission layer forms due to day length response, shortening in day length. Cold temperatures play a role, but it's much diminished to day length. That abscission layer forms, it literally cuts off the xylem and the phloem, creates a little protective layer, kind of a waxy layer to kind of put a cork in the xylem, the xylem and the phloem tissues that connected from the twig out through the stalk of that leaf and ran out to through the veins of the leaf, cuts those off, kind of corks them off, and then that leaf drops off. All right, at that abscission layer. Probably somebody right now is starting to type in the question, well, my pin oak tree holds its leaves all throughout the wintertime, or whatever tree that you have. Yes, there are some trees, especially in younger ages, don't form that abscission layer very well. Why that is, I've not really seen good explanations for it. It's just that it's not detrimental to the tree. It's not a sign of anything harmful. There's some genetics involved in it. Why that is, though, I don't know. But it's usually not an issue. There are times if your tree has been subjected to some stress, maybe late in the year. 2012, again, that I know I keep going back to that drought, but that was a good example because the trees really started shedding their leaves early. And sometimes those abscission layers didn't form very well. So the leaves just went brown and they hung on the tree all throughout the wintertime, or a lot of them hung on throughout the wintertime. And then hopefully if that tree refoliated in the spring, the new growth kind of pushed those old leaves off. But sometimes that was the indicator of the trees that didn't make it. They suffered too much during the drought and they just never formed the abscission layers and ended up dying. Trees turn color in fall because the green pigment goes away. It breaks down. It's not needed for photosynthesis. That green color breaks down and exposes these things called anthocyanins and carotenoids. The carotenoids are actually always there. They're the yellows and oranges that we see exhibited in the leaves once the chlorophyll breaks down, but those carotenoids are typically always there in the leaves. They're just masked by the dominance of the green pigment, the chlorophyll. The anthocyanins are produced when we get those really good fall color years, meaning we get some nice extended days in fall where it's 60, 70 degrees, it's bright sunny days. lots and lots of opportunity for sunlight, and then we drop down. We really cool off at night, maybe in the 40s, maybe the upper 30s. Well, the trees are, man, they're still producing energy. Those leaves are producing energy during the day, right? The photosynthesis is going on. But then when it cools down rapidly at night, the tree can't move that energy stored in the leaves or created in leaves. It can't move that energy out of those leaves into the twig before that abscission layer gets formed, and that those sugars are trapped in the leaf. And that's when we have really good years like that, you'll get some really brilliant reds and purple colors. The more extended time we have of those kind of really warm, warm fall days, cool nights, you're going to tend to get those more brilliant reds and purples. All right, let's hammer roots. Keep moving right along. One of the things I really want to point out, take a look at that upper picture, and I'm going to show you guys another diagram here coming up, I believe. Roots are there to obviously anchor the tree. We did talk about that there is some storage that goes on there, obviously some energy storage, but they're really there for absorption and conduction, right? They're absorbing the water and the minerals from the surrounding soil and conducting it through the root system and up into the trunk and out through the leaves, if we're talking about water, through the xylem. The absorbing roots are really tiny. People will call them hair roots. Really, really tiny roots they're the ones doing the absorbing. The bigger the root is, it's there for structural support, anchoring the tree into the ground. And if you look here, tree roots do not grow down to the center of the earth. There has been this, and I have seen this diagram in biology books as recent as probably 5 to 7 years ago, where the top of the tree and the root system of the tree are mirror images of each other. Baloney, that's wrong. All right. Root systems of trees are not mirror images of the top of the trees. As a matter of fact, most of the time, there's a greater volume of tissue in the root system below ground than there is above ground in a tree. Now that really varies by species significantly, and it's not near what it is in prairie grasses. So much more of the living part of a prairie grass is in the root system below ground as compared to what's above ground. But trees are that way as well. There's a lot of times more root system or more volume of tissue in that root system below ground than there is above ground. And what don't you see in this diagram? That good old taproot. Oh, that tree's got a taproot to it. Well, actually, they typically don't. When they're very small, and by very small, I mean if you buy a seedling, maybe through the Missouri Department of Conservation, and it's a black walnut, or it's that post oak that I talked about, there are some species of tree that have a taproot with them. They're very, very small. But as that tree increases in size and that root starts to grow down, here's the deal. When you start to move downward in a soil, your oxygen levels decrease dramatically in the soil, and roots respire. So we talked about trees doing photosynthesis, right? Taking in carbon dioxide, giving off oxygen. Trees also breathe. They respire. They take in oxygen and they give off carbon dioxide. Where does that respiration occur? A lot of it occurs in the root system. So oxygen is as important to a tree root as water is. All right, very important that you understand that. That's really where we see so many issues with trees, is we're dealing with low oxygen, highly compacted or saturated soils in an urban or suburban environment. The soil just gets packed down. Everybody says, oh, I got that lousy clay. Clay soils are actually great until you scrape all the organic matter off the top of them and you pack it down and put a house on top of it. Then clay soils are not so good because it's really pottery more than it is an actual soil. It becomes more like dirt than soil because we've taken off all that good organic matter. We've really compromised the chemical and biological activity in that soil, which we also negatively impact every time we throw fertilizer down, people, intent. And we create such a harsh environment for that root system that we really make things worse for a lot of our woody plants, thinking we're doing good things to take care of them. Can't go into a lot more detail than that because I'll run out of time. I can talk about that for hours. I saw Meredith smiling when I was talking about that. You knew I was going to get that in there, didn't you? But again, it's very important to understand. Think of a wine goblet sitting on a dinner plate as the structure of a tree. The stalk of the wine goblet, and the top of the goblet is the trunk and the canopy of the tree. That dinner plate is the depth and the spread, if it has room to do so, of that root system. So not very deep, but very broad spreading. And again, if you think in engineering and structure and how does that organism hold itself up, it's really better that it has this widespreading root system with what we call some sinker roots, some larger structural roots that then grow down, but they'll only grow down to the depth where oxygen is available. Once oxygen isn't there, they stop growing down and start growing laterally again. But that's really important. That structure is very important to how a tree holds itself up and how it can get to what it needs: oxygen, moisture, minerals. All right, that top diagram up there is actually a copy of a poster that was created by Morton Arboretum as a black walnut that they took something called an air spade, which just blows high pressure air. They excavated the root system and an artist came in and rendered this. It was a series of 4 posters called Roots. If you ever get one of them, they're really, really cool if you're a tree nerd like me. But you see that kind of red box. You hear people say, oh, tree roots only grow to the drip line of the tree or the edge of the canopy. Wow, what's all that stuff growing outside of that red box? Those are tree roots, folks. 2 to 3 times the tree's height. That's how far they'll spread out from the trunk, again, if they can. If there's not, big rocks in the way, or there's not a street or a sidewalk or a house in the way. Tree roots cannot penetrate rock, concrete, asphalt. They have no ability to hit a material like that, rip it apart, and grow in there. However, if there's a crack in that rock, in that concrete foundation, in that sidewalk, where's all the oxygen and water going to be? Right along that crack, right? And so the tree root's going to go, hey, look, all the goodies are right here, and start to grow along that area. And then what happens? Each year it increases in size, takes that crack, makes it worse. Okay, that's how roots grow in a nutshell, pun intended. The other really cool thing about roots is what's called mycorrhizae. And that's this relationship, symbiotic relationship between a whole variety of fungi and tree roots. And symbiotic relationship, if you're unfamiliar with that term, just means it's mutually beneficial to both organisms. Both organisms benefit. There is no detrimental impact to either one. And these mycorrhizae actually dramatically improve roots' ability to take up water and minerals. And what we're finding out about these mycorrhizal fungi is that they're required. There are, for most trees and actually all the tree species I'm familiar with, there's a host of a lot of various mycorrhizal fungi that will form this relationship with trees. And so there's plenty of them out there, plenty available. If you happen to be someone who really likes orchids, orchids are one of these organisms that we're finding out there might be one species of fungi that has formed a relationship with that particular orchid. And if that fungus isn't present in the soil, that orchid's going to die. It's not going to make it. So your niche types of organisms, or plants, I should say, niche types of plants that only grow in very specific certain environments typically have a relationship with maybe one or just a few number of mycorrhizal fungi. Or trees that we're talking about growing in Missouri, plants that we're talking about growing in Missouri, most of them typically have a relationship with lots of different mycorrhizal fungi to help benefit them. Pretty cool stuff. Okay, we have a raised hand. Must be an important question.
Hello, I don't know if you can hear me. I'm not too good at these Zoom calls.
I can hear you.
Okay, hi, it's Donna. I actually sent it on a question, but maybe it was a little brief. My question is about underground more particularly in the northwest part of the country, how there's a connection underground between the trees from far apart from each other, and that's apparently through mycorrhizae and fungi and almost like a massive area. Is there something like that here in the Midwest, or is that kind of an exclusive thing out there? And I was just wondering if you could touch on that.
Yeah, no, what you're probably referring to is as at one time, the biggest living organism was a quaking aspen, was thought to be a quaking aspen.
Yeah.
Because it covered a huge amount of acreage. One organism had sent up multiple shoots and had this massive root system. But then what they found was that these fungi below ground were way bigger, covering tens of acres greater than what the expansion of that root system and that structure of that quaking aspen had been. And so, yeah, so these mycorrhizae, and again, there are some that are more, with any kind of living organism, there are species that tend to be what we call generalists, and those that are more niche that I was talking about. They live in a very exacting type of environment where they need, a relationship with certain types of elements in the soil or certain minerals or things like that. A lot of them are generalists. So there's the same for these mycorrhizal fungi as well. And these generalists may form these relationships between multiple species of trees. Usually they're related to each other. They're in the same genus, as we call it, like oaks or maples or things like that. But in some cases, what they're finding, and again, the science on this is evolving. We're learning so much more about these mycorrhizal relationships, that there are species of trees that are not related to or closely related to each other, but the mycorrhizal fungi will be able to mutually benefit both.
Yeah.
And so they are absorbing, water and minerals and benefiting both. But, as we kind of talked about in that communication question, yeah, there are some hormonal triggers going back and forth. And if you want to call it communication, I'm not getting into that debate tonight. You're gonna have to feed me beers, and we can sit down and have a great discussion over some beers on that. I think it's very cool. I think there's a lot we don't understand about it, but yes, that does exist. Anywhere there's plants and mycorrhizae. Okay.
Thank you.
Paused. Can we just knock out a couple other questions?
Yeah, let's do it.
Built up here. Okay, one here. How much water can full-grown trees move per day?
Hundreds of gallons. I don't know that that's been really accurately measured, but I've seen thousands of gallons in some cases on a daily basis, and on some really huge water pumps like cottonwoods and bald cypress and things like that. I don't know. I've not gotten deep into the research on it, but my concern is on that I've seen some pretty broad variation in that. Tens of gallons, hundreds of gallons, thousands of gallons. It's significant. And one of the things that I learned by being a dummy, I guess, is I put this really cool Dawn redwood only about 10 feet off of my foundation. I was not concerned about there being disruptions or the trunk of the tree or the root system of the tree negatively impacting my foundation, because it was in good shape. But what I found was, because they grow so big so fast, it was sucking so much water out of the soil that my house has settled some. This is an exaggeration. I don't know if you can see my camera, everybody, but my house, has actually settled some over there because it was drawing so much water out of the soil. Surprised me. Next.
All right. On a similar note, why do leaves sometimes flip over to their other side before a possible storm or rain shower?
Well, actually, it's just how what we call the petiole is formed. That's just the leaf stalk. And some are flattened to be able to actually orient themselves to maximize their sunlight. Leaves of some species will actually change their relationship to the sun to maximize their exposure, again, to just create as much photosynthesis as possible. And then also, in situations of high wind, some of the flattened petioles are that way to reduce the water loss, right? As those winds pick up, you might get some more evaporation out of the leaves. So as I understand it, that's partially why they're reacting to those circumstances is water and sunlight exposure.
All right, so we have another one. What about the cone of juvenility as it relates to tardy leaf drop?
I have no idea what that is.
Ah.
the code, man, that sounds like, I'm going to date myself here. It sounds like something from Get Smart, but I think that was the cone of silence, the cone of juvenility.
Yeah.
I don't
Mark,
know.
I actually
we gotta get you on our mailing list. Mark Halpin just wrote a great article about that in our Forest
Well, then
Keepers.
Mark Halpin can answer it because I have not heard that phrase before.
Yeah, I mean it's basically so like on a small oak, the entire tree is juvenile. But even on a much larger oak, it retains juvenile hormones, typically lower in the canopy, and that's why you'll see some lower branches, and especially when you see like water sprouts or suckers coming off,
Sure.
because that's juvenile tissue that, for whatever reason, like you said, no one really knows why it retains its branches. But the idea behind the cone of juvenility staying low in a mature tree is that it's assumed, the top might blow out, the tree can regenerate itself. From
Yeah.
those.
Okay. Yeah. I just hadn't heard it termed in that phrase before.
Yeah, I only learned about it a few years
cool.
ago. But yeah,
Yeah.
I just wrote an article about it. I might just send that out to everyone rather than take up more time right now.
I'm going to be the bad cop here, team, and just say that we only got 15 minutes. So I want to make sure we get through all of Mark's presentation, and I know how he can talk.
Don't worry.
So I want to let him kind of go through, and Mark Halpin will kind of keep track of some of the questions. So please keep those questions coming. And then those folks that need to sign off can sign off, and we can maybe keep the questions going for a little bit after the talk. Does that sound good, Mark?
Yeah, we'll not break again until the end. That's fine. Not a problem. Wow, you know how I can talk. That's the pot calling the kettle black there a little bit. Okay, so we talked about photosynthesis, and again, don't get caught up on all the verbiage on here. We have the process of respiration, which is burning that energy. So energy is produced through photosynthesis. Respiration uses that energy and then turns it into a usable source to be able to be utilized by the tree in growth or reproduction or maintenance or defense, those types of things. So photosynthesis produces it, respiration breaks the bonds and releases that energy so it can be utilized into those different facets of the tree. The reason why this picture popped up is in a low oxygen environment, like I talked about earlier, respiration can actually exceed photosynthesis. So the tree's actually using more energy than it's creating. So in flooded conditions, all right, that this can occur in situations where you have where you have heavy foot traffic that has packed that soil down, because again, the organic matter has been stripped off. The top layers of the soil has probably been stripped off. You're talking about a subsurface of a soil, and those clays can pack down very easily with our feet mashing down on top of it, to the point where, and you can't see it in this photo, I usually have a bigger photo with this, but just on the right-hand side is a sidewalk. But we'll just take the street for the example, that if you measured what's called the bulk density of this soil, in other words, how fast or how quickly, how easy it is for oxygen and moisture to move through that soil, down through that soil, the bulk density of that soil can actually be greater than the bulk density of the concrete or asphalt in the street, meaning that water and oxygen will move more readily through asphalt and concrete than it would some of these soils. Not a good place for trees, all right? I'd love to go into more detail on that, but we don't have time. Transpiration, not going to talk about this much. Again, that's just how water moves up in the tree. Understand that with all these various forces, cohesion, adhesion, transpiration, evaporation, driving those pumps, the pump system, it does not fully explain how water can move against gravity in a tree. We don't understand what's missing in that equation, which is kind of cool. The only thing that's going to be important for you to take away through this is what I talked about before. We just put a term on it called osmosis. Water moves from high concentration to low concentration. That process is called osmosis. I hit this one to death. Phloem transport is from source to sink, so I don't need to spend any more time than that one. But just, again, understand, remember we talked about the rays, and you can really see them in this nice cross section in the lower right-hand corner. See those lines running out from the center of the tree out towards the outer bark? Those are those ray cells. And in times of stress, when the tree really needs to grab that energy that's stored in the functioning sapwood and some in the heartwood that still has a little bit of functionality or storage that can be accessed, those rays are going to kick in and move that energy that's stored in those cells into the phloem, which can move it from where it's stored or where it's created to where it's needed in the tree. Just quickly here, what I want to point out is, we hear this all the time when we're talking about our kids. Is it the environment that affected them, how they were raised, or is it the genetics involved? Same thing with trees. All right, this is one similarity between trees and people that I'll buy into. So what you see there in that photo is willow oaks growing down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. Same species, planted at the same time. The trees on the right are a whole lot bigger than the trees on the left. The answer to why is pretty obvious, because the trees on the left are put in little tiny boxes. Remember how big the root system wants to be? And they're put in what we call tree coffins, small little bits of soil where the root system can't expand, can't do what it needs to do, and really restricts the growth of that tree. So that's the environment. When we're talking about genetics, the genetic part of it, look down in that lower bullet point, the left-hand side of the screen there, where we talk about something called a cultivar, which means cultivated variety. That's a clone. So every red sunset, red maple, in the absence of any type of environmental impacts, like a fat bird sitting on the twig that breaks that twig off, or somebody with their pruners, or a lightning strike, or a heavy wind that affects the development of that tree, every red sunset red maple will look 100% identical because it's a clone. We've been cloning plants for a long, long, long time. Think like Hanging Gardens of Babylon. When you take a cutting from a plant and you stick it in soil or stick it in water and it sprouts roots and grows, it's the same individual. That is a clone of the parent that you took it from. That plant, in the absence of any environmental impacts, will look 100% identical. Now that's not going to happen, right? There's no way environmental impacts are going to occur, but I just want to go through the difference in that. Quickly, what I'm showing here, if you look on the graph on the right-hand side, we'll go through this real quick. You see the growing season down at the bottom of that graph, and you see just lengths of growth really up the vertical axis or the left-hand side of the screen. But this is really the timing of when all these tissues actually grow. Now, note, this is a pine species in a far northern climate. That's why you see this kind of really restricted growth season. From really growth, and this thing doesn't even kick in until May, where around here we're, could be late March, running through October. It's pretty restricted. But notice that each curve is a different part of the tree. The leader or the shoots of the tree are really only growing for a very short period of time. The vascular cambium has a couple little growth spikes in this particular species, generally in the springtime for this northern climate. Foliage, same thing. Look at roots. Look at how we have a spike of growth in the spring and a spike of growth in the fall. Why do we plant trees in the spring and the fall? Because that's when roots are regenerating. When we plant trees, we're moving them from one environment to another. During that process, roots are going to be lost. They are optimized to regenerate that root system during those two periods. Fall is better generally because we don't have those impacts of summer coming up very quickly. Like if we plant it in the spring, we get in, we hope that tree gets settled in and is able to regenerate the roots. And boy, those temperatures go up and the water faucet usually turns off. and it's pretty stressful. Whereas we put it in the fall, those roots are going to keep growing until we have really cold weather like we're having now, and the soil temperatures go down low enough that roots stop growing. They'll grow down to about 43 degrees. With a soil temperature of 43 degrees, most plant roots will continue to grow. So in some years, they might grow throughout the winter. So you have all that root growth time before it comes around again to that next stressful time, that next stressful summer. Not going to talk about that one much. Going to buzz through these because this is it. This is the coup de grace of all the things we've talked about. This is compartmentalization, which again, I know Ben is going to talk about at great length for the pruning talk, but I want to point it out here because it is really cool. This is how a tree responds to wounds. Trees do not heal. They have no ability to repair damaged tissues. So now that you guys are all tree experts after my impressive talk that I've given to you, when somebody says, well, little Johnny from next door came over with his pocket knife, has carved his initials into the tree, will it heal? Your first response should be, no, it's not going to heal. Let me tell you why. What trees do is they are growing systems only. So all they can do is generate tissue. They generate new tissue. They cannot regenerate damaged tissue or repair damaged tissue. So what they do is this cool chemical process, and it all occurs when they're wounded internally in the wood. So how fast a tree closes over a wound or seals over a wound really has little to no impact on this compartmentalization process, how a tree is responding to a wound. It's these chemical barriers that the tree forms internally in the wood structures to try to prevent decay organisms from getting in and rotting out that structural tissue or the functioning sapwood, which is what's moving water back and forth in the tree, or up and out, sorry, not back and forth, up and out through the tree. There's 4 walls. You see them listed there, 1 through 4. All right. Wall 1 forms at the point where the wound, how far in it went into the tree. So little Johnny with his pocket knife carved 1 inch deep. So at that growth ring, at that 1 inch depth, wall 1 tries to prevent this spread of decay from moving that point towards the center of the tree. Now, if you've ever looked at a tree that's been rotted at all and still standing, it's not a very strong wall. Decay generally moves pretty readily into the center of the tree. Why? What did we talk about? The functionality of the heartwood, right? It's reduced, or it's non-existent, or that tissue is considered dead. It just can't form that barrier very well because there's no functional tissue there to form that barrier. So decay will spread in towards the center of a tree. Well, how does a tree respond to that? It's a growing organism, right? A generating organism. It keeps adding wood tissue. So you can lose, pipes can be very strong, right? A tree's not exactly a pipe, but you can lose that internal tissue pretty readily and still have a very sound structure to a tree. Wall 1 keeps it from moving vertically in a tree. I said that wrong. My goodness, I've done this so many times. I jumped ahead on myself. Wall 1 keeps decay from moving vertically up and down in a tree. Again, not a very strong wall. It's generally the direction that things are being moved in a tree. So trees can't plug that tissue to keep it spreading vertically. Wall 2 is what I just described, from the growth ring to the depth of that wound in towards the center of the tree. 3 is where the rays get triggered. So if you see that pie slice of wood, you actually see a discolored pie slice in the center of that chunk pulled out. Those rays are those spokes moving from the center of the tree out. That forms a very strong wall. So oftentimes you'll see an area of wood rotted out, and then this barrier along these straight lines that forms that keeps decay from moving around in a circle, all right? Spreading around from the edges of the wound in and wrapping around in the center of that wood tissue. And the strongest wall forms at the point where the tree grows the new, and the undamaged tissue is able to start growing a new growth ring, and it keeps decay from moving from that wounded area into the new growth ring. And that has to be strong, because if you decay the tissue, the new tissue, remember, that's functional, and moving water and the phloem tissue, which moving your energy around in the tree, if decay is able to kill that tissue, then you have a dead tree as well as a decaying tree. So that's compartmentalization in a short period of time. And that's an excellent place for me to stop. And I got 3 whole minutes by my clock here. And as long as people want to answer questions and you want to field them, I'll stay on and answer questions. I might cut it off at midnight, but you know, I'll go for a while.
Great. Yeah, we have quite a few that have backed up here. So
Sure.
let me find where we left off. So I think this is the first one. So someone asked, I have heard that if you take mycorrhizae and soil from a healthy oak tree and put it where an oak is that isn't doing well, the oak that is not doing well will improve because it now has the fungi it needs. Is this true?
Yeah, that's a nice thing to think about, but it's just really too simplistic in the way it's being thought of. Because here's the thing: there's these mycorrhizal packets that are out now too that people are buying and throwing in when they plant a new woody plant in the ground. If the site is poor enough that you think you have to buy a mycorrhizal packet to throw because the fungi is not there, throwing that packet in or adding some soil to that area, if the environmental conditions are not conducive to that mycorrhizae already being there, chances are, because it's such a poor site, you can add it all you want to, and that mycorrhizae just isn't gonna take off and grow. So, you know, something has caused that site to not have the mycorrhizae to begin with. In the case of fire, we talked about fire burning through forested areas and wooded areas. You'll get concentrations of wood and that fire will burn really intense. And some of those organisms will be negatively impacted by that. But the point is that there's so much abounding nearby that they just quickly repopulate any of the area that heated up so much that maybe those organisms were killed off. But if you're talking an urban, suburban area, that typically means your site's just so bad. There's something there, whether it's a soil pH issue or concentration of some compounds, some chemicals, maybe that's just too high. You know, herbicides, like I said, fertilizers negatively impact these organisms as well. They can negatively impact mycorrhizae because there's salts in fertilizer. Salts are toxic to a lot of these organisms. So I'm not saying fertilizer is always bad, but we put way too much of it down. It's way overused. And if you plant in the right place and do these good cultural things that you're going to learn about in these future sessions, you don't need to do it. I haven't fertilized a plant in my yard since I moved in 20 years ago, and I have some very happy trees.
On a related note, here's one that almost got by me that I think you'll enjoy. Is turf grass a limiting factor for tree root expansion?
Yes, kill it all. Get rid of your turf grass, people. I do not like it. Nowhere in the world is turf grass in a native relationship with trees and shrubs. They are competing organisms, and turf grass is very, very good at drawing up as much moisture and elements in that soil as it possibly can, with a very dense fibrous root system that is very well adapted to doing that. Trees try to outcompete turf grass by growing big and shading it out. That's why you can't find, I don't care if you plant a quote unquote shade mix of turf grass, you got dense enough shade by the tree, it's not going to grow. The turf grass just won't be able to compete because it's not getting enough sunlight. So you want to make your trees really healthy, get rid of your turf grass and plant it with native plants or put mulch down. Because again, go back to those pictures that I showed you in the beginning. Where was the turf grass in any of those native woodland or forested ecosystems? Doesn't exist.
And on a related note, do you want to just address, no one asked this, but I hear this constantly.
Are you serving one up for me?
Well, people just say, you know, I asked, well, have you been watering this tree? And they say, well, sure, my turf grass gets watered.
Yeah.
So the tree's getting that water.
No, it's not. Because again, turf grass is really kind of a creation. You know, playing around with various grasses that naturally occurred and you know, they responded very well, or what we created essentially is an organism that's very good at grabbing water. It's very efficient at it. And so even with those root systems, you know, a lot of people think you water turf grass every other day, 20 minutes per sprinkler zone if you have an automated irrigation system, and that's taking care of all my woody plants. No, it's really not, because you're not watering very deeply. You're turning your turf grass actually into a crack addict, because if you turn off the water for more than about 5 days, stuff's going to brown up. You want to water deeply over long durations. You don't want to water frequently with short durations. Water deeply, long durations, let it dry out. Best way to figure out if a plant needs water, stick your finger in the dirt, people. It's not more scientific than that. If it's dry, water it. If it's wet, don't. Science.
All right, moving along. Do ginkgo trees have an atypical root system?
I'm not sure what you mean by atypical, but not for them. No, they have the root system that they've evolved with. They're a very old organism, which maybe is what you're asking. And believe it or not, they're a conifer. If you ever look at those ginkgo leaves, all those lines down through the leaf are needles that have been compressed. They're the predecessor of every tree species across the earth is younger and has had much less time to evolve than ginkgo has. Ginkgo has survived through ice ages. So it's a unique organism, but it still is a conifer, and it still has a root system that functions just like all other woody plants that we've talked about. Hopefully that gets it. If it doesn't.
I want to jump in here really quick, guys, and just make sure, as we're kind of losing some folks here at the end, to thank everybody for attending. I know some folks have a really set timeline. And as far as the protocol, we'll be recording these sessions, and we'll do a little bit of editing and housekeeping to get them to a point where you can access them. There was a question about PDFs, so we'll try and capture some of the PDFs from our presenters and make those available if there's a few things you want to look back on. And then Mark will be sending out information on next week's classes and the speaker bio and everything on Monday. So I just want to get that out there for anybody that needs to sign off and put their kids to bed or whatever else. And now I'll open it back up to the wealth of knowledge that is Mark Grueber.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, another one here. What explains the variety of average lifespans of various species?
That's evolution at its finest. So let's kind of go back to our example between the cottonwood and the post oak. So post oak has evolved to compete on sites that are very dry and very rocky. It has a taproot when it's young because it wants to get that root down to depths where water is available, which is lower down in those dry soils. It grows very slowly. It has a very rot resistant wood. It's evolved to be there for a long period of time. Longevity allows it to get to the point where it matures and can keep trying to reproduce and keep trying to reproduce and keep trying to reproduce. Where that cottonwood is a grow fast, die young. You know, the candle that burns bright, burns half as long type of thing. It starts reproducing when it's very, very young, and its seed is adapted to float on water because it grows in really wet areas where flooding occurs. People will talk about, oh, cottonwoods are really flood tolerant. They're actually not very flood tolerant at all. They're kind of moderate in their flood tolerance. So when flood waters come up and sit, cottonwoods will actually die out pretty readily, but they grow and reproduce so quickly, you never know they were gone. Cottonwoods seriously can put on 10 feet of growth in a year. They are a very weak wood. The wood is not decay resistant whatsoever because they're an environment where, and again, have adapted to that wetland, frequent flooding, being bashed by all the debris that gets washed down in floods. They've adapted to that environment by, I'm not so worried. And again, I'm anthropomorphizing here. Trees don't have a brain to think this through, but they're trying to grow up very, very quickly. They start reproducing at a very young age, spread their seed all over everywhere. And if they get bashed into or flooded out, they have zillions of offspring to take their place. Where that post oak is in a site that's not as conducive to that ease of reproduction. So it's there for longevity. So that wood is very rot resistant. They've co-evolved with those decay fungi to be as resistant as possible to that. Doesn't mean they can't decay, but they're very resistant to it. So they're there for a long time. We talked about it a little bit when you were talking about the what'd you call it, the cone of juvenility. There's really cool process called retrenchment in trees, whereas they get really old, the structure isn't what it was. Kind of like me some days when I'm feeling my age. The trees will actually decrease their size. You'll see that dead wood kind of start to accumulate in the upper part of the canopy because that tissue isn't as efficient as moving the water and the energy that the trees created. And they're also more susceptible to some wind damage, so they'll actually make themselves smaller to not have to move that energy in that water the distances that it had to before and to reduce storm damage. And we call that retrenchment. It's pretty interesting stuff for a tree nerd.
All right, let me find the next one here. So, oh yeah, what's the best way to remove turf grass around trees? Are lasagna mulching strategies too suffocating to tree roots?
Generally, no. I mean, you can probably do a pretty fair job of killing out the turf grass. That's a new term for me too, lasagna, but I'm assuming you're talking about using plastics or shade cloth or things like that to smother it.
I think it's like layering like newspaper and
and generally the newspaper isn't going to be too much of an issue, but generally the length of time that you're going to have it on there really isn't going to have a significant impact on tree roots. Now, if you take the thick black plastic and you put it down and you leave it on there for a long period of time, thinking that you're going to keep weeds from coming up through, then you're going to have a negative impact on the oxygen and water infiltration. But if you're just trying to smother out turf grass and leave it on there a couple weeks, shouldn't be a big issue at all. Herbicides, I'm not getting into that debate. If you don't want to use them, don't use them. They're effective at knocking out turf grass. You have to be wise, follow the label instructions. Most of the time, with all this stuff that you see flying around, it's us misusing them that is the problem. So there's a reason why there's a label on there, and believe it or not, it's actually federal law, and the feds could prosecute you if you're applying an herbicide illegally. Now, no one's ever going to know or understand what you're doing, but just know that that's actually federal law, technically.
All right, this could potentially be the last one here.
Okay.
Do you believe that once a tree is planted in the soil but doesn't live long, that placing a new tree in that same spot is not the correct thing to do, as the new tree senses this is not a good place to grow? I do believe this, by the way. This is the person asking the question, not me.
Okay.
I have had this occur with small dogwoods 3 times in a row.
I will pretty much guarantee you that it's actually you're trying to put the wrong plant in the wrong place more than anything else. Again, we don't know of any sensory organisms or organs that the tree has. So we don't need to debate that. That again, we can sit down in a bar and drink some beers and have that discussion. But you're also talking about a species flowering dogwood that's very temperamental to its site conditions. And I see that species more than any other planted in the wrong place. They won't take full sun. They won't take compacted clays. So there's so many variables to that question. It's not an easy one to answer, but you have to take in your site conditions. Do I have a compacted clay soil? You can figure that out pretty quickly by digging a hole, not with frozen ground, but when the ground thaws, dig a hole about 1 foot down, fill it up with water, see how fast it drains. If it takes all day for that water to drain out, flowering dogwood's the wrong choice. It won't make it there. You need to pick a species that's much more tolerant to wetter conditions, those lower oxygen conditions, because you have a soil saturation or a low oxygen concentration issue. But there's a lot of variables to that question. So no, my short answer would be no. That doesn't automatically mean that you can't plant a tree there. It just means that most likely either there's something wrong with the nursery stock, which does happen fairly frequently, or there's some site condition issues and you're not matching the species you want to plant to the site well. You need to make a better choice for a species that's more tolerant of the conditions that you have. Do a soil test. You can get a soil test done through the extension office, Missouri Botanical Garden, Brightside St. Louis will take them. Any extension office, there's one here in Kirkwood, that'll take them to $20-25, and they'll give you all kinds of information, which will be helpful in selecting the right plant for the right place, which should be one of your classes coming up too. So you're going to talk about that more, right?
Yeah, I'm going to be talking about that. And yeah,
Oh,
I'll go over
perfect.
that. I'll go over that in a little more detail. I basically say
Outstanding.
3 strikes and you're out if you plant the same tree fails in one site 3 times. It doesn't belong at that site because of site conditions. So we have just one more, a nice simple one.
Okay.
Do you have a good reference book that you would recommend for basic tree biology?
Well, my favorite, I didn't get to talk about it, but the quote that was at the beginning from Dr. Alex Shigo, A New Tree Biology, honestly, that's my favorite if you're a super tree nerd. There are some kind of condensed versions of that. If you just type into your favorite search engine, tree biology and Dr. Alex Shigo, S-H-I-G-O, it's even up if his name's still up on this coded slide on the second bullet point if you're looking for the spelling of it. Put that into your favorite search engine. He's passed away, but his daughter is still making his materials available. Some of his books are out of print, but you can buy some smaller publications of a lot of this same information that was written by him and condensed down if you don't want to buy a big thick textbook like A New Tree Biology. What's great about that book is it's got pictures on every page, which is good for a guy like me that is a visual guy and not very bright. He needs to see it in picture, and then Dr. Shigo would put text explaining the picture each and every single page. So he was a very hands-on type of guy. His favorite phrase or favorite quote was touch trees, that you can't understand an organism without interacting with it. And he was a huge proponent of touching trees, just get out there and touch them, experience them. And I 100% agree with him on that. Great man.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, I think that wraps it up. We still
Cool.
have 53 people around. Those
I
are
see that.
the true tree nerds sticking around to hear every last bit of your presentation. So thanks
I
to
hope they
everyone
enjoyed
again for listening. And thanks again, Mark. Always a pleasure to hear you talk. I know I've
Thank
heard you go through this same presentation when I took my ISA class many years ago. It was a great review, but
Thank you. Appreciate
always
that.
always good to hear you talk.
Hopefully I didn't
And-
bore people too much. I know it's a lot of info, but I love it. It's cool stuff.
And so, yeah, next week we'll have Mark's counterpart, Danny Moncheski, also MDC Community Forester. He's going to be covering tree ID, and we'll keep moving along. So we'll see everyone next week, 6 to 8 p.m. Wednesday night.
Cool. Good night, everybody.
All right. Good night, everyone.